Non-Americans, what are the conspiracy theories surrounding your government? Story 1, Netherlands here. In 1992, a Boeing 747 crashed in a populated area in Amsterdam, the Bijlmermeer neighborhood, ending at least 40 people on the ground, plus maybe some illegal immigrants. A day after the disaster, people reported having seen men in white, astronaut-like, or chemical suits at the crash site. Officials denied having sent these people. Then the speculations began. Some say the mysterious men were foreigners, having arrived by helicopter or cars with French plates, collecting some sort of evidence, and soon they were linked to health problems of some neighborhood people after the crash. The cargo plane was of the Israeli airline El Al, and the plane was carrying secret military equipment. There were quite some political debates and research around these rumors, but it has never been fully disclosed. Still, people speculate the Dutch government knows the true story. Story 2, Canada was developing a supersonic fighter jet during the Cold War. It was called the Avro Arrow. 5 of them were completed, and the project was abruptly scrapped. No one to this day is sure of the true reason. The reason is very clear. The proposed missile defense shield was going to be more cost-effective and simpler to implement, negating the need for a high-speed, long-range interceptor aircraft such as the Avro Arrow. A beautiful piece of Canadian engineering, but redundant nonetheless. Pioneered all sorts of things in the aerospace industry, from high-speed engine inlets to delta wings. Too bad it wasn't needed. It would have been quite a feather in our Canadian hat if you're into weapons manufacturing. I'm not, but damn, engineers are badass sometimes. Story 3, I'm from a wee town in Scotland called Lockerbie. Clearly there was a certain plane which was blown up and landed on the town in the 80s. I was only born in 94, so not an eyewitness or anything. But throughout my childhood, every single person in the town seems to be more convinced that the Americans were behind it than the Libyans. The reasons for this are numerous, but the prime one was that there were, supposedly, a couple of CIA agents who were switched onto the flight at the last minute, and who were also approaching rogue status with their recent actions, thus needed convenient disposal of. Of course, I have no evidence for any of this, as I have never really been interested enough in the case to devote any time to it. P.S. My sister did a school project on it after they closed the case and said they didn't need any more evidence. So, yeah, we have bits of the plane in our basement. Story 4, there's a stupid theory going around that the newly elected Howard government in 1996 in Australia engineered the Port Arthur massacre in order to push their gun control agenda. A gun control agenda that didn't exist in the minds of anyone until those events took place. I think the proponents of this theory give way too much credit to any elected official that they could, in the space of 6 weeks after getting elected, set up the chain of circumstances that led to the tragic events. One of the things proponents of this theory put forward is the unasked for testimony of the guy who was the commander of Australian Special Forces in Vietnam, saying that the shooting was way too accurate for one mentally handicapped man to have done by himself, ignoring the fact that for a total of 35 dead and 23 wounded, over 400 rounds were spent by the shooter, also ignoring the fact that none of the 23 wounded or any of the people there who weren't wounded saw anyone else shooting. Story 5, New Zealander here. Not sure when this was supposed to have happened, but before we had state highways, there was a large amount of debate about whether NZ should invest in private transport and build a ton of roads, or public transport, build a ton of trains or trams or subways. The political party which won that election got a massive amount of funding from Japanese car companies, ensuring that their profits would soar with an influx of cars to be driven on our roads. Fast forward to 2012, New Zealand has the worst public transport system I know of, and the average household owns 2 cars. Story 6, Australia. The right-wing Liberal Party has managed to convince many people in the Australian population that missing out on the global financial crisis, Australia hasn't had a recession in over 20 years. Having unemployment around 5%, banks didn't go bankrupt, housing hasn't burst, we live almost the longest, our schools aren't failing, etc., is just some giant conspiracy on the Australian Labor Party's part to convince us that life is good. Story 7, I'm surprised there aren't many conspiracies from East Asia. Here's a few from Hong Kong or China. The government in HK, despite whatever claims of independence it has, takes orders directly from Beijing. Their primary goal is to ease public tensions and slowly shove pro-China sentiments down our throats. Our first chief executive didn't really step down because of health problems, but because Beijing explicitly told him to do so. The last chief executive election was rigged by China, so now we have some really pro-China guy. Beijing really has not much control over the rest of China, especially in the western and southern parts, as long as the leaders of each province keep public order. Occasionally, when the officials go too far with their corruption, Beijing will just pick one at random and execute him to scare the rest. If you want to launder a lot of money, Hong Kong is one of the better places to do it. There's hardly any background checks, and banks just care about turning a profit. Many officials use this as their ticket out of China. Pacific coastal cities in America and Canada, pretty much San Francisco and Vancouver, are full of Chinese wives and kids without a father at home and a buttload of money. It's a way for officials to protect their families and assets from the government and or triads. Most of this money probably isn't legally gained. Story 8, Germany. That Chancellor Merkel was a high-ranking communist back in the DDR who sneaked into the Conservative Party after the fall of the Berlin Wall, while still secretly being communist. Now, she uses her power to turn Germany into a communist nightmare. Like always with good conspiracy theories, there's some truth to it. She was in the youth organization of the ruling party in East Germany as Secretary for Agitation and Propaganda. At least that's what some sources say. But she never showed any left ideology after the reunification. Story 9, Portuguese here. One of the most known is the fact that back in the 80s, the recently elected Prime Minister Francisco Sá Carneiro was traveling by plane, and the plane was sabotaged and fell, ending all occupants. We think it was the government's inside job because he was an honest person. The presidents and prime minister after his death were greedy and dragged our country to a now huge economical crisis and deficit. We also have a prior prime minister suspected of transferring government money to private offshore accounts of many people, or money mysteriously disappearing from government safes without any record of withdrawal. Story 10, Chinese here, this is a bit different, as it's not conspiracy theories that people have of the government, but rather conspiracy theories that are around that I suspect are started by the government. Here are some. 1 month before Mao died, he told his closest aides that his death was imminent and inevitable. He then proceeded to detail a plan. The plan goes like this. After he died, his body was to be secretly taken to his hometown, where there is a well near his home in the village. His aides were to find the well, then slowly and carefully lower his body down. If they did this, Mao claimed that he would come back to life after 1 week, at which point his aides were to lower a rope and let him out. Apparently, Mao's aides thought he was too ill and therefore delirious, and so ignored his orders, so this did not happen, and Mao didn't come back to life. The USA and CIA are behind every single protest in the country. This, of course, includes the Tiananmen protest in 1989, when CIA agents disguised as Chinese students instigated violence from the Chinese students, and the Chinese army was forced to defend itself after having Molotovs, provided by the CIA, and rocks thrown at them for over an hour. There is a story, an official rumor, that in 2002, a U.S. military ship patrolling the Chinese water regions decided to provoke the Chinese by accidentally entering Chinese territory. A Chinese submarine was nearby and decided to approach and stick close to the U.S. ship. The ship was going to drop some warning underwater shots to establish its authority, but the blip on its radar of the Chinese submarine suddenly disappeared after appearing to be approaching rapidly. The U.S. ship looked everywhere for the sub but couldn't find it, and in the end decided to leave the area because it was getting uncertain. Turns out the Chinese skillfully maneuvered the sub directly underneath the U.S. ship to not only keep a close eye on the U.S. ship's activity, but also completely avoid detection. Apparently, the U.S. Navy realized what happened afterwards and decided they shouldn't mess with the Chinese Navy again because our Navy is too well trained and skillful for the U.S. Navy to handle. Story 11, Nepali here. The 2001 massacre of almost the entire Nepali royal family has been attributed variously to Gyanendra, the then king's brother who went to become king himself, the Indian government, the then Maoist rebels, and the Nepal army. Despite official statements and many eyewitness accounts claiming that Crown Prince Dipendra was responsible for the massacre, a large section of the population still believes there is a conspiracy surrounding the massacre. I wouldn't be surprised if there was. However, Nepal is a notoriously small country, and word gets around very fast here. If there was any truth to the rumors, I think we would have heard something by now, as the monarchy has since fallen and the Maoists are not rebels anymore. Story 12. Swede here. The MS Estonia disaster in 1994 is believed to be due to Sweden smuggling ex Soviet military equipment on board and therefore being sunk by Russia. There are many Cold War conspiracy theories, mostly regarding Soviet submarines deep inside Swedish territorial waters, of course, fueled by the Whiskey on the Rocks incident of 1981. But also, a Swedish DC 3 was shot down by the Soviet in 1952 and was denied on both parts until the 90s. And to this day, there's no trace of the crew except for the pilot and two others found in the wreckage. Story 13. Mexican here. That the two most important political parties, which are right who used to be left and extreme right, are actually the same thing, governed by a secret council. This theory is supported by the last presidential candidate from the third most important political party. He ended up second this time, which actually is composed of people from the first party. That elections are rigged by the previously mentioned secret council. A presidential candidate for the 1994 election was shot and perished while on campaign. The conspiracy theory is that he was ended by the people of his party because he wanted to change things, that the Catholic Church is the real entity that governs this country. These are the ones I can think of. Story 14, a phenomenon found only in Sweden. Some people are convinced they are allergic to electricity flying in the face of science. Nobody has been able to demonstrate that this allergy exists other than as a delusion. During the 1980s, a Soviet submarine ran aground in the Stockholm archipelago. The Soviets claimed it just lost its way, but in Sweden, this began the period of the periscope sickness, where scores of people reported seeing submarines deep into the archipelago, similar to the UFO phenomena. In spite of the Swedish Navy being beefed up year after year, not a single Soviet submarine was captured or destroyed. It was later revealed that the Navy had been dropping depth charges on wrecks on the ocean floor and had been chasing sonar contacts that turned out to be made by animals and schools of fish. Not even the US thinks there's anything to this obsession. Also during the 80s, the Prime Minister of Sweden, Olof Palme, was murdered by an unknown assailant. The investigation went off the rails almost immediately, going after Swedish Kurds on the theory that the PKK was behind the Prime Minister's death. There were also various shady private investigators making fools of themselves. After the police gave up on the Kurdish trail, they arrested a junkie named Christer Pettersson. He was put on trial and found guilty, but on appeal he was found not guilty, mainly due to botched police procedures. In the meantime, another conspiracy theory started to take hold. Palme was assassinated by South Africa because of his support for the ANC, maybe by Swedish police officers. Much like the JFK conspiracy theories, there's not much to this, and it probably was Christer Pettersson acting alone who did it. Doesn't stop a few stalwarts to keep looking for the murder weapon, though. Although by this point, it is probably just a smear of rust on the bottom of some lake. Story 15, oh, I got one. I hope it doesn't get buried. I'm from Mexico, and there is a state in the north called Tamaulipas. Its capital, Tampico, is next to the aptly named Sea of Tampico. There, several people firmly believe that aliens live underwater and protect the city with their brain powers. Apparently, there have been several hurricanes that have gotten really close to hitting Tampico, but they always calm down before touching land. So the only explanation is that aliens are happily living in the Sea of Tampico, chatting about how beautiful it is compared to maybe Cancun, the Mayan Riviera, or Los Cabos, and saving the city from certain catastrophe with their powers. Ricardo O'Farrell, a comedian, makes a funny point about this in one of his shows. Edit. Upon further investigation, it turns out that the hurricanes change direction completely before hitting Tampico. They do not calm down, as I said. Still, the conspiracy is that aliens repel hurricanes with telekinesis or something. Story 16, here in the Philippines, our former president turned dictator, Ferdinand Marcos, did not in fact steal money from the national treasury. Rather, the theory is that he actually discovered the Yamashita treasure, a gold hoard collected by the imperial Japanese general, Tomoyuki, together with some second-born imperial prince. All the treasure plundered by the Japanese from Southeast Asia during World War II were brought to and hidden somewhere in the Philippines. Later, in their haste to retreat from the Allied advance, they were unable to retrieve this vast treasure hoard. Dictator Ferdinand's wife, Imelda, publicly stated that the source of their family's fortune was from this treasure hoard, not from stealing from the country. Thus, the state shouldn't repossess her art, jewelry, shoes, and other belongings since they were bought using wealth that they discovered, citing the rule of finders keepers. When pressed on why they kept this treasure instead of returning it to those countries they were taken from, the family's supporters cite the rule: losers, weepers. The court unsurprisingly ruled this to be bullcrap, reaffirmed that the Marcos wealth was stolen from the treasury, and subsequently ordered the seizure and sale of some of these treasures, returning the proceeds to the government. This, however, has not dissuaded the believers of the Marcos cult of personality, and they still maintain that the Marcos wealth was legitimately acquired from finding and keeping hidden treasure. Story 17. Germany has a huge Reichsbürger scene, literally citizen of the Reich. They believe that the German Reich legally never ended, and that the Federal Republic is merely a company with limited liability, Deutschland GmbH, which they believe is apparent in the fact that an ID is officially a Personalausweis, a personal identification card, with personnel and personal being the same word in German. They take this badge as an example that Germany is just a company and all citizens are actually mere employees and servants. Also, they're violent, growing, and have destroyed people already. They're closely connected with the growing Kanan group in Germany and the far right. That Reichsbürger thing sounds like the German version of the sovereign citizens movement. Most countries have some version. In America, there are those who refuse to recognize the Constitution and instead claim to still be ruled by the Articles of Confederation. And here in the UK, we just had a person arrested for keeping their hair salon open during lockdown because apparently they only follow the laws set in the Magna Carta, a text written in 1215, by the way. Story 18. The Alberto Nisman death is, I think, the most accepted here in Argentina. A federal prosecutor appeared dead in his bathroom the day before presenting evidence against the president, Christina Kirchner, about covering up the responsibles of the biggest terrorist attack we ever had. The whole investigation was shady and unprofessional, to say the least. The gun used was from a friend of his, and all security cameras of the building weren't operational that day. Also, the way he shot himself was in a very uncommon position. Today, he lives on as the original "E didn't end himself" meme on the internet. Story 19, Nicaragua. The elections were free and fair. Our president isn't a dictator. There is no corruption in the government. All our problems are because of the Salvadorians, Hondurans who take our jobs or are in gangs here. American tourists are ruining the country. American tourists don't appreciate our country. And Americans keep telling us what to do with our country and keep trying to stop us from letting the Chinese build a canal through our country so we can be rich. You know, like Panama's rich. Story 20, Indian here. Our former prime minister, when he was studying in the UK, married an Italian waitress who, as the years went on, almost ended up becoming a prime minister herself. There are many people who believe that she was planted there to spy on India and loot India so that the Italians could get rich. Recently, I heard an even more juiced up version that the woman's father was a KGB spy, and it was actually the Russians who wanted her to seduce a future Indian PM. It's hilarious. Story 21. There are people who think that Germany is not a sovereign and independent state, but rather still being controlled by the allies of World War II, most notably the US. Equally interesting is a conspiracy theory from our history that's probably worth sharing here. After Germany lost in World War I due to manpower, food, and equipment shortages, USA entering the war, etc., there was an immensely popular conspiracy theory called Dolchstoßlegende, dagger strike legend, which claimed that Germany would have easily won the war if the parties of the German parliament had not actively sabotaged the war effort and stabbed the forgetting forces in the back. Needless to say, proof for any of the premises or the conclusion was never found. This conspiracy theory really helped the NS movement, though, because it made the democratic system unpopular among patriotic people, of which there were many in the highly militaristic German Empire before the war, and was unsurprisingly one of the most used propaganda stories during the 20s. Story 22. So, growing up in mid to late 90s Spain, I heard a lot of theories on how the wealthy and connected Spanish have been stealing babies from poorer families. It got to the point that When my neighbor gave birth to her second kid, the grandmother wouldn't even leave the baby alone because she overheard a nurse saying, "Que lindo," and she instantly panicked. Apparently, it's a conspiracy theory she heard as a child herself and didn't see evidence of it ever stopping, which was why she was so concerned over her new grandson. Then 2011 happened, and we all found out about the Madrid cases and Dr. Eduardo Vela. Back then, there wasn't a lot of hard evidence, and most of the time you'd have Francistas telling us to shut up and claim we were all lying. We knew that children were stolen during the Civil War, but we didn't have concrete proof that it kept happening when the war was supposed to be over, and that the Republicans weren't just the targets, but literally anyone that could be dehumanized by Francistas. Story 23, probably the most infamous man in Mexico, is the ex-president Carlos Salinas de Gortari, and no doubt there are tons of stories around him in his life. Some might be true and some fiction. Supposedly he was behind the assassination of his would-be successor Luis Donaldo Colosio, the one in charge of getting current President Peña Nieto elected, so that Peña would work as his puppet, think Putin Medvedev. And also that Carlos Slim's company, former richest person in the world and owner of phone company Telmex, is actually Salinas. The immense wealth of the company comes from stealing from his time in the government, and that Slim is just a face, so Salinas isn't in the spotlight. This dude is literally Satan here, and is commonly referred to as the unnameable one, much like Voldemort. A friend's grandmother was his teacher when he was studying at the UNAM, biggest public university in Mexico, and described him as a brilliant individual. Some people say that his influence is so big in Mexico that he has a say in everything economic and politics-wise. He's the person every PRI, political party currently in power, politician reports to. If this stuff happens to be true, he's undoubtedly the owner of Mexico. Story 24, that there is a huge German hideout in Antarctica with high-ranking officials and a full German army. Allegedly, British and American troops have been trying to conquer it back over the last decades, even with nuclear weapons, but without success. There were a number of German expeditions between 1903 and 1939, which is where this comes from. There are actually some people here who believe this. Source, German only. The English Wikipedia doesn't mention the conspiracy theory. But wait a moment, you asked for actual conspiracies, not crazy theories like everyone here is telling you, right? Story 25, the Dutch Marxist-Leninist Party that existed from 1970 to 1990 was actually a Secret Service shill to discredit the far left. They called this Project Mongol. Source, the Dutch Secret Service has also infiltrated the anti-fascist action, ACFE, and holds several leading positions. They organize, among other things, contra-demonstrations when the far right is demonstrating. Source, Republicans are repeatedly arrested by accident and released as soon as they arrive at the police station. The man who threw a candle in the Queen's general direction, this was a couple of years ago, has been in prison for 2 years as pre-arrest. His actual sentence was only 5 months. Dutch newspapers don't publish news that is negative for the new Ukrainian government. Examples. They didn't publish the leaked phone call from Payet. They didn't publish that Joe Biden's son is now a director at the Ukrainian gas company, etc., etc. Story 26, Mexico. Drug war. Some people believe that the last Mexican government, 2006 to 2012, helped the Sinaloa cartel and the Gulf cartel, La Federación, in order to defeat the Juarez cartel and Los Zetas. But the arrest of the son of El Mayo, one of the leaders of the Sinaloa cartel, was not part of the pact, and El Mayo ordered the assassination of the Secretary of State, Juan Camilo Moreno, in 2008. His plane crashed in Mexico City. With the victory of the other party during the last elections, it looks like the pact with the Federation is over. El Chapo was arrested in Feb, and Z40 was arrested last year.